Marika, thank you very much for inviting me. This feels, like Marika said, this feels a bit like coming home, even if it's just over Zoom. I did my PhD at KTH, and I was living in Stockholm for 9 long and very nostalgic years under Professor Christina Hook, which was in Mobile Life, which was an incredible privilege and a great time and place to be in. And currently, I am an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm affiliated in a kind of interdisciplinary research group called Technologies in Practice. And I'm really, as Marika mentioned, I'm really excited to talk to you today about this because it's not only a topic I'm very passionate about, but it's also something I'm still trying to kind of make sense of. So hopefully I've come some way in that sense making that I can hopefully communicate something of interest to you, but also I'm very much looking forward to saving some time at the end for conversation. And that this might be a little bit of a challenge because I end up having too many slides. And so I am going to talk a little bit fast, but I'm going to try to not skip things, and I'm going to try to be coherent in how I speak. But and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to read a lot of quotes from other articles and from other work, because this is work that is mainly based on looking at other literature. And so like I'll try to connect those dots together. So you'll be reading a lot of quotes that will be on screen. I will also be reading them. Hopefully you can follow me. Hopefully I'll make it like a transition that is like sufficiently clear and smooth that you can follow these ideas that are not in the end so complicated. So to begin, this is situated, as Marika said, within ICT4D or ICTD, which refers to Information and Communication Technologies for Development. And it's essentially the field of international development where ICTs kind of take the center stage. And so a lot of the projects either focus on understanding things like, how to design and implement or study ICTs within like developing communities. And in practice, there's a lot of work that revolves around things like improving communications for farming, to support farming or e-learning, or issues around gender empowerment and so on. And typically the projects tends to be rather small scale and short-lived, serving mostly a research purpose. And this is an example of my own. So this is a project that I did when I was interning at Microsoft Research in Bangalore in India. It's called Krishi Pushtak, and it's a social network that we developed that was meant for use by low literate farmers. And so the interaction was entirely based on image and sound, and it's allowed us to explore and write about two distinct topics mainly. One was around the interaction of low literate users with digital technologies, but also issues regarding the sharing of technology amongst rural communities, something which is often referred to as intermediation. And I mean, this is by no means a full picture. This is just sort of to present with an example of my own rather than turning to others' example, but just to give you a bit of like an idea of the kinds of projects that one of the types of projects that comes from this field. And so, and because this deals with a kind of inherent asymmetry between Western and developing world, or different ways of talking about this kind of difference, is kind of unavoidable to discuss this distinction when talking about this work, because it is positioned very much in that distinction. And so one of the main concerns historically is that the West has historically imposed its own kind of epistemic and technological structures onto a colonized developing world, and that these are kind of by virtue of that, these have been kind of inadequate, right? So this approach of sort of like top-down imposing of technology, knowledge-making practices, and so on from the West to the developing world, those that are kind of the targets of such interventions, has been widely criticized in much literature, but also within ICTD. So, for instance, Kentaro Toyama, who has this kind of idea of technology as not changing of social, that his idea is that technology is an amplifier of social will or social structures, but doesn't actually change them. So he writes something along the, I'm going to read the sentence. So projects fail, so ICTD projects fail because they don't design context appropriate technology, they don't partner with local organizations, adhere to social cultural norms, account for poor infrastructure, build relationships with local governments, invite the participation of the community, provide services that meet local needs, think through a viable financial model, and provide incentives for all stakeholders. And a lot of when reading this, a lot of this kind of intuitively makes sense, but of course it raises a big issue of, okay, so a lot of this has to do with engagement and the participation of the people who are going to benefit or receive these technologies. And so it raises a key concern around, okay, so what does it mean? What does this mean for participation? How is participation thought of in ICTD? How could it be? How is it now? How could it be better? What are its failures, and so on? And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is through the lens of participation, even though I will look at it, from like different terms. But the main kind of concern is this idea of participation. What is it, and what does it do? Peter Oakley, in his book around projects with people, where he looks at sort of like participation as like a concept. It's one of kind of a quite interesting book in the 90s, where he's looking at sort of, he establishes this kind of way to talk about participation in this kind of developing environments. And so he says, in the traditional approach to development, it is well known that the administrator of development projects and the beneficiaries do not sit at the same side of the table. So there is, again, here kind of similar to what Kentaro Toyama was saying before, there is this notion that the interests of those doing the development and those receiving the development might not be aligned. And this is kind of what drives pretty much all accounts of participation. It's like we need to align these concerns. We need to involve the person who was previously like uninvolved, no more top down. Let's give a voice to those who were previously voiceless. And so if we go back to Toyama's statement and we like highlight, I just wanted to highlight, this is kind of what I will do to a lot of the quotes that I will present today. I'll highlight sort of some of the terms that I'm kind of interested in. And so here is context appropriate, local organizations, adherence to social economic norms, local governments, participation, community, and local needs. And we can immediately see how, even though these things, intuitively probably seem good and kind of intuitively good for most of us, you can, as you start looking at some of these things, they immediately raise a lot of issues. What are these, social cultural norms? What are these local needs? What is a community, right? And so to shed light on this, I've tried to look at this by looking at the use of the term local more specifically. So that's kind of the point of departure, and I'll discuss the details in a second. So participation in this lens, it's construed as something that we need to pay attention to and we need to do. And it's, it requires us to pay attention to context. It's a power shift in the way it's framed. It's a power shift. It gives voice and power over to the people who were previously powerless and voiceless in determining their own sort of technological futures. We see this kind of in participatory design traditions when talking about sort of HCI or design more concretely. It is an effort to include, and it is an effort to include, which is not only like a moral obligation, but a practical one that builds better systems, that builds better interventions, right? So this is kind of how participation. This is how I understand participation being talked about in this other work, right? This is why people advocate for participation. So this is kind of what I did. This is just a short methodological slide. So I got all the papers that had ICTD and ICT4D between 2010 and 2015 from the ACM Digital Library. I did this by hand because they don't have any way to do this automatically. So this took me some time. And this is why I haven't updated this corpus since 2016 when I got it. At some point, I'm going to add some more papers to it. But right now, this is what I had. And then I coded. So I looked for all the instances of local. And I just went around and I coded things. What do I think that is implied in kind of that this kind of stating of local and so on. And of course, there's a lot of ways in which local is used in very unproblematic ways. The local store, no one has like an issue with what the local store means, and so on and so forth, right? And then there's a filtering for impact in that for the purposes of the relevance of this analysis, I tried to avoid sort of bringing out quotes from work that was kind of from more junior scholars or work that is not heavily cited or that not referenced at all, just so to avoid drawing my analysis on perhaps more vulnerable academics and so on and so forth. So, and also because I think the issues that I will talk about are kind of prevalent and not just something that you find here or there. Okay, that's it. So now that's the kind of introduction and methodology. So now I'm going to go through 5 findings or 5 themes that I think are kind of that kind of emerge from looking at this corpus and these works. So the first one is that local is presented in a way that everyone benefits. So talking about like the alignment of goals. So this is from a paper. I have the citations, the references below. I will share the slides if you then want to have a look. From an economic perspective, researchers have found that small-scale local actors can actually have lower costs than larger ones by leveraging existing infrastructure. Similarly, decentralizing these networks could potentially empower the local community, increasing opportunities and freedom. And so this is from, this is a project that does this pilot installation of locally owned cellular networks, so like in Papua New Guinea. And so the idea being here that, doing something local with this kind of local resources is not just, it's actually technologically better and like economically more viable, right? So in the same paper they talk about, we believe that local ownership and local profit incentivizes local actors to support the network. And if local people profit from the network, they are more likely to care when it fails. So there's this kind of assumption, of course, that local is economically viable. So we don't have even, we kind of don't have to deal with the morality of it. We just, it's just better in every possible way. And so, and of course, this, and of course, this is again a kind of, in many ways, maybe like a reasonable assumption to make that people will care for. Also, like this idea that people will care if something is local, but it does, of course, immediately raise issues about, how is locally assigned and who counts as local. So who exactly is, owning this? Is because I mean, of course, you cannot just assign to like a local ownership. Some structures will eventually own it more than others. Who is actually this local that is profiting, and what counts as local ownership and so on. So in many ways there's there's an implication that there's like a property of local that is kind of unproblematic, but actually raises more questions perhaps than it raises in the sense of like how is it assigned and to whom. And so just to kind of wrap it up, so this kind of everyone benefits theme is that researcher participants share similar goals, that they can share similar goals, and that drawing on local serves also these higher economic purposes and so on. So like we don't need to we don't need to think too much about it. And actually there's a move here that is a bit that can raise some eyebrows in the sense that it kind of removes in some ways the responsibility of deliberating and discussing kind of ethical considerations around engagement, right? So if it's good for everyone, then the ethical answer is kind of the ethical question is kind of answered. The other one is around knowing the local context. This is just names that I've kind of tried to summarize what the idea is. So this is from another paper that looks at like a paper-based tool for eliciting knowledge about like geographical surroundings from like local communities. And so what they say, this is a quote from the project: as a sound understanding of the local context precedes any good development project or process, we feel that local ground is the name of the project, be invaluable in helping international support organizations communicate more effectively with the communities they serve. So here, there's this idea that we can understand the local context, and we can do actually that before we engage in the project. And in that sense, the local context is not only knowable, but it's knowable for the aims of the project, and can be used productively. That kind of knowledge, once it is made and once it's can be used as an input to design. And I'll get back to this later, but here the thing to highlight is very much this idea that there is such an object as local context that is stable enough that we can figure it out before we go into design in this kind of development projects. There's actually a lot of themes. I will stick to 5, but there's another one that I find quite interesting, is that while this local is knowable, and we can describe it, it actually, it also is usually portrayed as resisting formalization. And so here is a sentence. This is about work that is kind of disputing how apps that focus on like market mechanics are inadequate for like farmer use in China, in rural China. And so the quote is, behind all these agricultural specific processes, there are well-rooted traditions and habits that allow the formation and circulation of knowledge and news around the village. This rich and layered local knowledge is mostly based on oral exchanges and face-to-face encounters, and often relies on family ties and clan networks to evaluate the trustworthiness of the communication. So what is kind of interesting is that this is kind of very much aligned with this anti-Western knowledge-making practices rhetoric, where the Western knowledge is, placed as attempting to kind of formalize knowledge, and the knowledge is somewhat, in some ways, is protected from that formalization, with an appeal to, this knowledge being like rich, layered, and based on this kind of local norms or local culture that makes it so, but makes it also very hard to formalize and to build into systems, right? So we can know about it, but not maybe in the ways that like we know about other things. And so there's also like this other implication that the local kind of stabilizes over time, and that these are processes that are generally to be preserved because they have this kind of mystical value in some way. So the local resists formalization. It's at odds with the Western ways of knowing and the current logics of technology, and it is stabilized through this idea of tradition that kind of stabilizes in kind of these mystical ways, and it's seen as a move against Western epistemics. So this is the third point. Now the fourth one has to do with the researcher gaze. So, and here I'll jump straight to the quote. So this is a case study of mobile phone applications looking at having people report on water quality issues. These are prototypes. So based on our experience and focus on rural environments, our approach to ICT development has been that the investigation of the local context and solutions responding to local needs are more valuable and sustainable than a general one-size-fits-all design. Okay. I think someone is unmuted and I'm getting some echo. Wait, is that okay? Well, I think it's done. Yeah. So the issue here, in terms of like the researcher that I wanted to bring out in terms of the researcher gaze, is that there is, there is this presupposition that like the researcher can know. So we have talked about sort of how the context can be knowable, but now we are talking about how the researcher can know. So like based on our experience, and so like the researcher has this kind of authority over the thing that is being observed and can talk about sort of local context and local needs kind of authoritatively in this more abstract way. So the researcher can know, and they can know through experience, and this experience comes from this like embeddedness in the field site, which allows the researcher to then translate these complexities and speak for these complexities to not internally, not to those communities obviously, but to the wider academic world, or to the wider like publication networks that they are involved in. So finally, and to close the kind of this is the more like empirical part of this, there's this issue that is kind of one of the central issues also, when you read like post-colonial theory and so on, which is the collapsing of multiplicity. So the collapsing of complexity of those that are being observed, those that are being looked at. So, and here local, yeah, so I'll jump that. So one example of this, for instance, this is work that looks at like across, they look at 25 countries, they interview 10 people in each country, and they look at sort of costs to and barriers to public access of computing. And they say at some point in the methodology section, they say something like interview guides were prepared in each country, depending on the local needs and context. Each country added questions that they felt were relevant to the local context, which enriched the overall body of evidence. And so there's there's a few issues here with how the local is sort of produced here. One of them is the main one actually I'd like to highlight is how quickly and often there's, local can refer to many things, from a village to, in this case, a country, right? So here, there's 10 people that are, um, 10 of the participants here are based in India. And so the local context here refers to India, as a whole. So they can adapt these questionnaires and they can adapt these methods to the specific localness of India. And so this is kind of quite a common move in that is often criticized in post-colonial literature, which is this this move towards collapsing the complexity into ideas of like locality. Like the other can be sort of like localized in like very specific ways, and sometimes even in like these very broad ways. Like we could speak for, like someone can speak for India authoritatively through this kind of like sampling and so on. And of course, there's a lot of other issues actually, because also there's an issue of also kind of epistemic authority, because people are recruited over like online forums. So so there's already like a very like specific framing of like the kinds of people that are participating in this and so on and so forth. But yeah, so this collapsing of multiplicity, kind of, and here I might be overstating some of the claims that are being made in this paper, but it is just to bring out sort of some of the more long-lasting, kind of some of the more prevalent post-colonial points, is that local knowledge is somewhat static, and it is knowable to the developer. The developer here is the researcher or the person doing the development initiative. So the local knowledge is somewhat static. It's somewhat knowable to the developer case, and it's kind of extractable, right? So it's something that we can. This is a little bit of a repetition of some of the points before, but it's something that we can like extract from the context and put it to use for the benefits, hopefully, of the people that will eventually receive those benefits and so on and so forth. Okay, so now I will shift to sort of some of the concerns, because maybe, I don't know, some of you maybe find some of this stuff compelling, but maybe some of you are thinking like, so what? Like, who cares about this, this kind of analysis? You're putting like names onto things, who cares? And I would say that there's actually like really deep issues of, there's really deep concerns around how things are talked about in academic literature in general, but specifically in ICTD and this kind of work, where that are divided into four main categories. So the first concern is around participation. The second concern is quite specific, and it's actually about sort of epistemics and how knowledge is generated. The third concern is one of the most important to me, which is a more like ontological concern, how people are represented, how the kind of objects of the site, the objects of development are sort of created and circulated and so on. And then the last one is around deference and capture, and I'll get to that in a second. If this doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine, because I'll get to that at the end. So around participation, this book that came out last year by Sasha Constanza-Choc called Design Justice has a really nice section about participation and participatory design. And the way she talks about it is that she discussed participatory design in that, so she writes, well-meaning designers employ participatory design techniques for a wide range of reasons. For one thing, the process of working with community members is enjoyable. It can be quite fun, and it can feel empowering for both design professionals and community members. Unfortunately, products, patents, processes, credit, visibility, fame, the lion's share goes to the professional design firms and designers. Community members are too often end up providing the raw materials that are processed further up the chain. And so what she's talking about is participation as this kind of extractive mode that is often concealed in these narratives of aid and developing and assistance. It often doesn't come through the fact that it's often hard to see who is benefiting from this data that is collected, from this analysis, from the research that is produced, from the papers that are produced, and so on and so forth. Like at all levels, like it is unlikely that all these supposed recipients actually receive anything of value in most of these projects, like in the long term or even in the short term. And so there's usually kind of this little bit mismatch between goals that is often, if you go back to my first point about the goals being aligned, being talked about as being aligned, there's often more of a discrepancy than perhaps people would like to kind of talk about. And Paul Durish and colleagues wrote this paper also last year around on being iterated, which kind of it's also has been also like really inspirational because it centers like iteration as like a design practice, and they look at sort of the demands that this places on users. So they talk about what iteration demands of users is that they have the stability to invest time and effort without immediate benefits, that they be hopeful about the future, and that they trust in promises made by people in power. And so the article is definitely worth reading at length because it's much more interesting and deep than I will be able to do justice here with this short sentence. But essentially, it's like looking at participation through the lens of iteration and through this kind of even this glorification of, for instance, failure. Like when we do iteration, like we fail so that we can construct something better. So failure is often like glorified. But what is not often discussed is that it's not easy for everyone to participate. For some, participation is not something that began in that project, but it's something that has been ongoing historically because people have been forced to participate in all types of things, and for whom failure implies at the very least a loss in time and resources for the purposes of participation. So just just kind of these participatory concerns that are often overlooked when talking about communities in this way. So yeah, so just to sum up these participatory concerns, Christopher Kelty wrote a book also this year called The Participant that talks about participatory design as well, participation, and discusses how a lot of these modes of promise, like a lot of the participation that ICTs promised and ended up being sort of perfunctory, like in practice. But then there's also this concern that you see in Durish and Constanze Schock around it being extractive, it being burdensome on people, it being asymmetric, very asymmetric in nature. And then we have this kind of extra level that is the fact that, because participation in so many ways, it actually become, participation in ICTs in so many ways has become actually obligatory in many ways. There's many systems that we are forced to participate in, to access public services. We are, tracked, we are surveilled in this or this way. We are participating in all these different ways now. And so to like focus on participation as a goal in and of itself, it's today, I would argue, a largely insufficient lens. It's no longer at all, I mean, if it ever was, it is definitely no longer kind of a good enough argument to just say we want to increase participation, because it's participation for what and for whom, and what are the conditions and the costs and so on and so forth. What is time now? Let me just check. Okay, that's okay. I still have 10 minutes or 15 at least. So the epistemic concerns. So what we talked about was the participatory. What does it do to participation? And now, what does it do to the knowledge generated? This is not the most important one, but it allows me to go back to like a paper I published at the end of my PhD that is called Why Play, and it was published at the Critical Alternatives Conference in Aarhus in 2015. Based on my PhD dissertation, it kind of summarizes most of what I say in my dissertation. So if you are interested in this but don't want to read my dissertation, then this is definitely the place to go. And so the scope of this paper, and you can see here, yeah, KTH, so my past KTH belonging. And so the scope of this paper, just very quickly, was to look at ICT through the lens of play, enjoyment, and leisure. And the paper identifies tensions within kind of ICTD work that tends to kind of overlook or ignore, or sometimes even constrain and limit the role that sort of enjoyment plays in how people and communities interact with technologies. So an example that I use in the paper, it's kind of been perhaps overused in some ways, but it illustrates the point really well, is how a particular ICTD initiative that deployed this kind of big ICT infrastructure across different rural areas in India was intended, like the point was to help people communicate knowledge about farming and tips and so on, to sort of improve overall farming output and empower farmers to increase their sort of farming practice, to improve their farming practices and so on, and increase their yield. was then, upon evaluation, was then mainly used to watch like online videos, share videos, have some fun, watch soap operas and so on and so forth, which shouldn't really be surprising to kind of anyone. But of course, when you frame things in this way, as people being first and foremost kind of deprived, then and then these projects are intended to help people socioeconomically, then of course it then is hard to evaluate these projects in any way other than that kind of frame. So this project was deemed a failure, and the whole ICT infrastructure, even though it was really a really great thing to have, it was sort of removed because the project was deemed a failure, right? So the epistemic concerns is that by assigning this kind of, going back to the local assignments, like local idea of participation and community and so on, that we configure the participant in often oversimplified ways through like broad characteristics. And by getting that framing, then of course we get, of course people have to like then conform with kind of how the researchers' expectations of local, and there's this whole like adaptation process going on. But ultimately and foremost, you fail to, and that's the kind of the argument in my paper, is that you essentially fail to have good empirical material because you are not engaging in any way kind of an honest framing, because people need to, if they want to have that infrastructure, they'll need to tell you kind of what you as a researcher is expecting to hear to just maintain that infrastructure and so on and so forth. So it kind of demolishes like conditions for like a good good knowledge production. And this is not the main point, obviously, because these people don't exist just for like the extraction of knowledge, and so this is just a kind of point in between. I think a much more important problem that is kind of related is that it is rooted in post-colonial thinking, is how local is sort of ontologically configured. And so here I build, so first of all, the local is kind of singular. It's usually, that's the collapsing of multiplicity that I was talking about before. Local usually tends to be singular and knowable, as I talked about. And I will just sort of use the kind of post-colonial lens by drawing on this definition or this approach from Dipesh Anand on his book Geopolitical Exotica, where he focuses on like post-colonial representations in Tibet. And this book is also it's phenomenal. So if you really want to read something in post-colonialism that really kind of just blows your mind, it's sort of like every other page, this is like the one to go to. And so he starts by, like, at some point he's describing sort of his stance, and he says, I use post-colonial to signify a position against imperialism and Eurocentrism. Western ways of knowledge production and dissemination in the past and present are not taken for granted, but put under scrutiny. And what I find really striking here is that it really offers a kind of way to think about, the point of departure of the use of like local as a way to kind of ascribe authority and return a voice to those that are kind of out there or that are in the kind of local space. But ultimately does that in a way that actually fails to like that perpetuates sort of the ways that like that kind of knowledge is generated and is made. So in one sense, I mean, to put it kind of simple, it's like how I think about it is in one sense, the move is let's give a voice to people to produce knowledge, but because the way that the knowledge is then like condensed, framed, published, it actually in the end it's more of like an extraction of data that doesn't really like subvert the thing that is supposed to be subverted, and it's just positions like sort of like the empirical lens onto something else, right? And I mean, I don't know how you would do this differently, but just like the kind of I think it's like an interesting positioning within this. So local or singular and knowable fails to really challenge these Western ways of knowing. And thirdly, kind of another issue within this is how it positions sort of the researched and the researcher in this kind of like surveillance, like the researcher's gaze kind of going in. And so this is from the same book. Sorry. Surveillance is a technique through which, under an overpowering gaze, the non-Western subject is rendered a knowable, visible object of disciplinary power. The gaze is not mere innocent curiosity. To gaze implies more than to look at. It signifies a psychological relationship of power in which the gazer is superior to the object of the gaze. This is this would be like an unfair overstatement if this is what I was claiming that literature is doing. I don't think that's what the literature is doing, but explicitly. But I do think that Anand makes a really compelling point about this relationship between who is being seen and who is talking about who is being seen, and so on and so forth, and the very idea that the researcher is not only visible, but it's like the research is not only gazed upon, but it's framed in a very static mold of the local, the context, the community, and so on and so forth. And so under the researcher's gaze, and emphasizes once more this idea of and these differences between who is looking in, who is out, who is in here looking out there. And there's like a really nice paper from Alex Taylor that sort of discusses this on a much better level, but it emphasizes, rather than serving these purposes of aligning goals, it does more to emphasize actually a difference, kind of latent to all of that kind of work. There is always a sense of difference that is being created. At least how I see it. Finally, and this is the last point that I will talk about in terms of concerns, but also one of my favorites. Finally, there is an issue of deference and capture. And here I am really inspired by philosopher Olufemi Otaiwo's really brilliant essay on elite capture and epistemic deference, which I urge you all to read. It's very short and it's really, his points are really articulated. Every sentence feels like it's saying something very important. And so I'm going to actually quote this article, which is very short, 3 times, because I think the points made are really, really a good way to wrap up this, and also like a way that has really helped me frame sort of my analysis of this. And so just for some context, Otaiwo reflects on, being a Black man and being asked to speak on behalf of Black people for a particular topic. He gives the context in the essay. And this is something that he called epistemic deference. So he's saying it's deference because it defers the sort of knowledge making and the communication of that knowledge towards groups that share a characteristic of identity that is seen as granting of authority in and of itself. And despite Otaiwo seeing himself as relatively privileged socioeconomically, and therefore, he feels like he has little to say about the issues that he's being asked to talk about, the prison system, all of those things, and the drugs or growing up poor, all of those things. He doesn't relate to that, and so that's the starting point of his essay. Is like, how do we deal with this? Being asked to speak on behalf of. And so the first quote that I'll read from him, because I love this essay, is so the forms of deference that often follow are ultimately self-undermining and only reliably serve elite capture, the control over political agendas and resources by a group's most advantaged people. If we want to use standpoint epistemology to challenge unjust power arrangements, it's hard to imagine how we could do worse. And so this idea that, the act of deference, the only thing that it does in practice is allow for, the idea that, you allow this abstract entity to speak, whether it's, because of your skin color, because of your gender, or because of your localness, is very much open to kind of elite capture, to serve, implicitly those in those categories that will be able to sort of already are in those rooms or are able to sort of enter those rooms kind of seamlessly. Secondly, and of course, this very much connects with researcher capture, the ability of the researcher to then in turn, kind of in a subsequent move to be able to speak authoritatively on behalf of these communities and so on, to others, to the outside world, to research communities and so on. A second quote from this article that I will read is, for those who differ, the habits can supercharge moral cowardice. The norms provide social cover for the abdication of responsibility. It displaces onto individual heroes, a hero class, or a mythicized past, the work that is ours to do now in the present. More importantly, deference places the accountability that is all of ours to bear onto select people, and more often than not, a hyper-sanitized and thoroughly fictional caricature of them. And I think, of course, this speaks really closely to sort of what But I'm talking about in the sense that in two ways, actually. One, because the ascribing of authority to a caricaturization or like a kind of a kind of implicit way of talking about groups of people, but also even more importantly, this abdication of responsibility, right? So it's the other, the vulnerable, the marginalized that is made. If that is kind of the starting point, that we need to give voice to the marginalized, then we are also putting all the responsibility to speak onto those that we have already decided are marginalized. And so that's what it talks about, like moral cowardice, which I think is kind of of course, like a strong statement, but it's like a really interesting way to think about sort of responsibility and abdicating that responsibility. And finally, when it comes down to it, the thing I believe most deeply, okay, I'll give you a little bit of context. So it talks about, I'll give you a bit of context just before diving into it, because it talks about trauma. And the way it talks about trauma is because he basically says, okay, so the reason why we believe these communities or these people are vulnerable or marginalized and we need to give them a voice is because they have been subjected to trauma, whether gender-based trauma, racial-based trauma, or in this case, kind of Western colonial-based trauma. And so this is the trauma he talks about, and like why do we make people in trauma speak? Why do we? And so when it comes down to it, the thing I believe most deeply about deference epistemology is that it asks something of trauma that it cannot give. Demanding as the constructive approach may be, the differential approach is far more demanding, and in a far more unfair way, it asks us traumatized to shoulder burdens alone that we ought to share collectively. And so again, this is kind of similar to the point before, but I just really like this formulation of asking of the trauma something that it cannot do to like solve its own conditions of its own trauma, right? So so in many ways, a perverse consequence of this kind of deferential move to defer the epistemic authority to the other is this it goes a little bit counter to a real politics of solidarity, whatever that would look like, because obviously these are not easy things to kind of address. So yeah, I'm almost done, and I'll just speak about two quick things, because of course at the end it feels like there should be a way forward, and the obvious way forward is to be careful when we kind of use like simplifications, when we label people in this way. But in a way that the issues are much deeper. This is not about finding better words to say the same thing. It's not about like deflecting to like a higher level of abstraction. Actually, there's like a few things that I think are maybe important to like think about. One is this idea of accountability versus deference, and I think this is really I think this is really central. And here I'm also like not only inspired in Olufemi Otaios, but also like Donna Haraway's situated knowledges, and how knowledge is kind of already very much situated, in the sense that like it's unavoidably situated in the sense that we are producing it in specific material moments in time and so on. And we are, I mean, if it wasn't situated, it would mean that we as kind of researchers have this all-powerful way of communicating that is not tied to our own existence. And none of us thinks of ourselves in that high regard. I don't think so. And so there is this kind of situated nature of knowledge production, which puts the researcher, of course, as the center of like the whole analysis, like in the knowledge making. And it's a practice that is really hard to do. And I think a lot of papers, maybe at least I've been seeing a lot of papers in HCI and so on that deal, for instance, with like vulnerable communities, where there's statements of like identity. People put like, I am like this, I am like that, and I am like a white man in his 30s or something like that, very privileged, and people put those statements. And I feel like that's very much inspired in this kind of situated knowledge, to be accountable, to make yourself accountable for your research. But I would argue that that does actually very little to make yourself accountable, and in many ways it actually makes you less accountable, because you have now excused preemptively your own behavior, right? There's no way that the reader has like an instinctive way of saying, oh, this is why your identity matters, this is why you being a man or white or this matters. Like, this is something that the reader needs to like make in their own mind, like from like this information, this often demographic information that you have given. And so you are not doing the work of accountability necessarily when you write that, and therefore, like in the kind of perverse sense, in many ways you could see that as like withdrawing from accountability by, preempting that critique and saying like, this is who I am, according to this like axis. And another thing that, also harrowing, so it's this idea of like staying with the trouble, that there is no, obviously, like if you are dealing with vulnerable, as all of you that deal with vulnerable marginalized communities very well know, there is no way to close off that complexity. There is no way to, and if you're dealing with trauma, if you're dealing with all of the issues that you're probably dealing with in your research, there is no way to close off that complexity and the kind of like the ways that you will be able to talk about it. All of those things are very much always in the open. There is never going to be like a clear solution to that. And so Arroway recommends, she talks about sort of this importance of staying with the trouble, in sort of like to not recoil from like the problematic encounters, which is kind of what I'm trying to talk about here. There's like this problematic encounter with like the local, but rather maintaining our engagement with it and the issues that it raises, so that you can sort of move forward, like staying with the trouble, not trying to deflect it to something else, not trying to create a category that allows you to sort of not describe more in depth like the kinds of things that you are doing or dealing with like all the kind of open questions that people may have, but actually like staying with that notion and dealing with that. And to end, I think it's like a turn also like to it's like a very simple thing is this idea that Constanze Chock also talks about in her work, that design justice practitioners must also engage with the fundamental questions about the definition of community. And therefore, it is possible to criticize simplistic conceptions of community and representation without throwing up our hands and accepting the Thatcherite position that there is no such thing as society. And so I just wanted to end with this because I know that, or I feel that this comes across as kind of like, in a way, like defeatist or like a kind of attack on this kind of work that is being done. And in a way, it is a critique, but in another way, it's also, very much an attempt to like improve and move forward in how we think about these things. And it's never in the spirit of disqualifying someone's work or anything like that, but rather just, finding what it is that we could be doing better when doing this kind of work. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for having me today.